How does lifting weights connect with hunger? Today, I'm going to show you 3 mechanisms that make your strength training a powerful appetite control tool, not just a muscle building tool. You'll learn why hard lifting sessions tend to suppress hunger hormones, often for hours, how your training changes your food choices without the need for willpower, and a strategic little trick that uses your post-workout appetite window to eliminate overeating at your toughest meal. Most people don't realize that their training is already doing half the work for them when it comes to hunger. They just need to understand how to use it. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the show that helps you build a strong, healthy physique using evidence, engineering, and efficiency. I'm your host, Philip Pape, and today we're going to talk about lifting weights versus cardio versus hunger. Most people think that cardio is a fat loss tool and lifting is for building muscle. Or even if they understand that diet controls fat loss, they think that cardio is a way to, ramp up your metabolism, burn more calories. And I get it, right? You burn more calories during, say, a 45-minute run than a 45-minute lifting session, but it's not just about math. And honestly, those differences aren't very meaningful because I think the math is incomplete. Fat loss isn't just about calories burned during exercise. In fact, it's not at all. It's about what happens to your appetite, your NEAT, your food choices, your ability to stick to a deficit for weeks and sometimes months without losing your mind, because we have to stick to it, but also not losing your muscle. And when you look at those variables, strength training comes out ahead by a wide margin. And you're like, why am I talking about this? This is weird. This is episode 7 of our 8-part appetite series for January, because appetite and hunger is a huge part of this. And I wanted to cover the mechanism that brings this together in terms of how your training, how your workouts actually shape your hunger and your cravings and your body composition results. Bring it all together. We've been talking a lot about food and sleep and stress and hormones, but today it's really more about how training connects with that. And then stick around to the end because I'm going to give you a really cool trick, if you will, a hack, a tool, protocol related to pre-workout meal timing and post-exercise appetite suppression to reduce overeating. A lot of you guys have a problem with overeating, and we can actually take advantage of our hunger signals related to training to offset that and potentially save you tens, if not hundreds of calories without changing anything else. Hey, this is Philip, and today's episode is sponsored by CaloCurb. If you've ever been in a fat loss phase and felt like hunger was working against you, CaloCurb's GLP-1 activator is a game changer. CaloCurb is a natural appetite support made from americete, a patented bitter hops extract that activates GLP-1 and other gut signals to help you feel fuller, faster. Clinical studies showed a 40% reduction in cravings and a 30% reduction in hunger within 1 hour. If you want to try it, go to witsandweights.com/CaloCurb for 10% off your first order. The link is in the show notes. That's witsandweights.com/CaloCurb. All right, let's start with why the cardio for burning calories or fat loss approach is a problem, why it backfires, even when it might look impressive on paper, and how that connects to hunger as well, because it's not just about compensation, it's also about hunger. We're going to address those topics. So when researchers study exercise and fat loss, they tend to see something that we've talked about more and more lately called energy compensation. And in fact, the not extreme of this, but one of the best examples of this research is Herman Pontzer's research on how our metabolisms are pretty steady from the age of 20 to 60, at least our BMR, and that doing more exercise doesn't necessarily burn as many calories as you think. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do exercise or train or move. It's a compensatory effect, and it depends on the type, the modality, and the quantity, right? And this is the tendency that for your body to offset the calories that you burn through exercise by either eating more or moving less the rest of the day. There are some compensatory mechanisms at the cellular level as well in terms of your metabolism, but a lot of this is other things like just you're compensating by eating and the types of food you eat and you're moving less, etc. And so cardio tends to trigger more compensation than strength training. that's the important takeaway today. There's a systematic review on training or exercise and energy intake in adults with overweight and obesity that found that exercise can improve appetite regulation, but the degree of compensation varies dramatically based on the type of exercise, the duration, and individual factors. So that's what I'm talking about. Now, what does this mean practically? Well, let's say you do a long cardio session. Let's say you do 45 minutes or an hour of, moderate intensity, right? On the bike or treadmill, pretty common type of exercises. And maybe you burn 400 calories. And you may not have, to be honest. That's what the machine says. And now you're pretty tired, you're pretty wiped, you feel kind of depleted. And what happens afterward is your body compensates in a couple ways. First, I earn this and I'm going to earn it back type of eating. Now, this is both conscious and subconscious, because after cardio, you may feel justified in eating more at a psychological level, right? But it's also real in that the body is craving these things, right? So then you have a smoothie right after you go for that run, or you have a larger dinner and you may not even notice it, right? It depends on how much control or structure you have over your meals to kind of offset that. But this happens a lot more after cardio than after lifting, for sure. Secondly, your NEAT tends to drop. NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, all the movement you do outside the gym, right? Walking, fidgeting, taking the stairs, standing while you work, chores, all that. And after you have a cardio session that's a bit exhausting, especially if it's longer, people unconsciously move less the rest of the day. They sit more, they skip taking the stairs, they're wiped out, they make little excuses or rationales in their brain continuously every time there's a decision point. And again, a lot of it's unconscious. So it's not like, don't blame yourself for this. A lot of this is unconscious. So then if you truly did burn 400 calories during that exercise bout, maybe you eat half of it back, 200. Maybe you have another 100 or 150 of calories you don't burn later because you're not moving. And so your net, if you're in a fat loss phase, your net deficit just got smaller, right? Because your metabolism is essentially lower while your intake is higher, right? So again, even if you control for the intake intentionally, you might feel hungrier and you still might have a slightly lower metabolism than you thought, if that makes sense. Now, compare this to strength training, where the session itself might burn a little bit fewer calories. Let's say 200 to 300. It's still more than you might think, but the compensation pattern's different because lifters often experience temporary appetite suppression after training, and they're not as likely to feel depleted in that reward-seeking way. And then because the fatigue is more localized, right? Maybe your legs are tired from your squats. Maybe your overall energy is still decent, but you're not totally wiped like you would from a cardio session. Then your NEAT tends to stay more stable because your body kind of feels like, there's still more things I can do. I still have some energy. I haven't gone for my walk yet, which is different than my lifting session. So there's again, psychologically and physiologically, a little bit of a difference there. And there's research to back this up. A 2024 review specifically examined resistance training and appetite-related variables because researchers, they noticed that the lifting produces different appetite outcomes than endurance work. And I think the research world is starting to treat lifting and cardio as different, tools for appetite, not just calorie burning, and also for body composition, and trying to look at what causes what. Now, I'm not trying to trash cardio at all. Trust me, there's lots of forms of cardio from walking to sprinting that I'm a big fan of. And cardio definitely can be a big tool. It also is not going to reduce your metabolism just because you're doing cardio. It's, again, the matter of the type and the quantity. And I think the compensation piece is only part of the story. So now, what is happening in your gut hormones after you lift? Okay, now we're bringing it back to some of the stuff you learned on the previous episodes in this series. If you haven't heard those, go back in our January episodes and look for the different ones about your gut hormones. So let's get into the mechanism. So this is post-exercise appetite suppression. So what does strength training do that cardio doesn't? A 2023 review on acute exercise and appetite control showed that moderate to vigorous exercise often produces transient, right? That's temporary appetite suppression. And these are your gut hormones. Acylated ghrelin goes down. That's your hunger hormone. PYY and GLP-1 goes up. Those are your satiety signals that help you feel full. And a 2024 update review confirmed that. Exercise-induced appetite suppression exists, and ghrelin is the consistent variable here in terms of the hormones. Now, this is temporary. It doesn't mean that you're going to eat less forever, right? But the window helps us because we can use that strategically, right? We're going to get into that. We can use that window strategically. So what makes strength training potentially superior here? Well, it comes down to intensity and metabolic byproducts. So higher intensity work, and that means, hard sets of strength training, higher loads, basically just lifting hard and heavy. And heavy doesn't have to be low rep, just getting close to failure and doing it the way you're supposed to do anyway to build muscle. It produces these metabolites in your bloodstream. You accumulate lactate, hydrogen ions, other byproducts of working hard and fatiguing those muscles. And then this creates a sympathetic nervous system activation, right? Your CNS, your central nervous system gets activated, the fight or flight response, all of that. And when you're in that state, your appetite gets suppressed. Your body is focused on performing and recovering as opposed to digesting and eating, because you might have heard fight or flight versus rest and digest. Well, you're not in the rest and digest. So ironically, as much as we sometimes call this a bad thing, it's a hormetic response, a stress response from lifting weights that will suppress appetite. And that's why post-lifting, having no hunger or having a lack of hunger is very, very common, where you finish a hard session of, lower body work, but upper body, I don't care, a hard session. And oftentimes the last thing you want is a big meal. You might want like a protein shake. You might want some water. You might want a little bit of carbs or something right after, but you don't have that, like, I have to devour everything in sight feeling that you do often get after a cardio session. It's usually absent. Again, these are generalities based on populations, based on studies, based on general observations, all coming together. It may not be you, but this is generally something we could take advantage of. Another paper from 2024 made a cool observation that acute exercise, okay, I'm just using the words from the study. Acute just means in the moment, a small amount of it, right? Like an exercise session can elevate appetite perceptions, meaning you might perceive yourself as hungry in some ways and yet not translate into increased energy intake because your gut hormones are powerful enough to override the subjective feelings. So that's an interesting one. And then there's something a lot of people don't realize too, that strength training, because it supports having higher protein intake, right? In other words, you tend to do both. You train and then you also eat more protein. And we know higher protein is one of the best satiety tools. It keeps you really full. When you lift, you naturally want to eat more protein because you want to recover, you want to support your muscle building. It just all supports each other, and again, you could definitely eat more protein without lifting more if you do it intentionally, but these tend to be corollary things that happen, okay? And all of these make the hunger management and food priorities easier, like less friction, with less friction. All right, now remember, I promised you a specific timing trick at the end to use this knowledge, to use this post-workout appetite suppression. We want to eliminate overeating, and we're going to build toward that. So definitely I want you to stick around. Before we do, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, CaloCurb. That's CALOCURB. We've been talking about how strength training naturally suppresses appetite by shifting your gut hormones, especially GLP-1. Well, CaloCurb works through the same pathway, but a different mechanism. It's a 100% natural supplement, and it has something called a marasate, which is a patented hops extract developed over a bunch of research by the New Zealand government, okay, not by a private company. It's actually funded by New Zealand, and it activates your body's natural gut-brain axis. So your satiety signals, so you feel faster, or you feel full faster. So if you take this at least an hour before you eat, and I've been taking it myself now that I'm in a fat loss phase, aside from occasionally a little hops burps, I'm sorry about that. I know it's gross. It does cause you to eat less. So if you have a plate of dinner and you normally eat the whole plate, you may end up eating 2/3 of it or half of it. And the studies show that. Clinical studies showed it reduced cravings by 40%, hunger by 30%, calorie intake by 18%. You have to wait at least an hour after taking the capsule. So put a reminder in your phone, take it like an hour or two before dinner or lunch. And what I appreciate about CaloCurb, it doesn't purport to do more than it does. It's actually pretty simple ingredients. It's hops, and it triggers a hormone that makes you a little bit more full. That's it. It's your own hormone. So it's upregulating your hormones. It's not replacing it with a synthetic, for example. So it kind of falls in between, using nothing or just food and the GLP-1 medications. It's kind of in between those. It's a great tool that works alongside lifting weights, hitting your protein, managing your training nutrition, eating your fiber, and timing your meals. And it can be an additional lever for those times when appetite is working against you, which is often, I'm raising my hand now, during a fat loss phase or mini cut where your calories are cut down. So ladies, if you're down in that 14, 13, 1,200, 1,100 calorie range, men down at 18, 17, 16, 1,500 range, that's when things get a little bit hairy, and this could be an extra tool in the toolbox. You don't need a prescription. It's just a single little capsule. You can go on and off, use it whenever you want. If you want to try it, go to witsandweights.com/caloCurb. The link should auto-apply my code WitsandWeights for 10% off. That's witsandweights.com/caloCurb. Link is also in the show notes. And now I want to get back to the training appetite connection, right? We've covered the hormonal and physiological side. Now let's talk about the behavioral and psychological stuff, because many people use food as reward, right? After a hard day, after a stressful meeting, after putting the kids to bed, after dealing with a tough boss, whatever, food often is the thing that makes you feel better. And that's emotional eating, stress eating, reward eating. We've all been there. You might be struggling with that right now. Maybe it's something you've dealt with in the past and have sort of put tools in place to move past it. We don't always 100% get away from it. It's always going to be there in our heads. We're human beings. We have parts of our brain that crave energy in that way. Strength training can become a reward instead. So I love this. I love pivoting so that we can swap one reward with another and satisfy that itch and satisfy that emotional need and that gap in a very positive way. So think about what happens when you're following a solid training program and you're tracking your lifts, your PRs, your sets and reps, your exercises, your loads, and you're seeing progress over time. You hit some new PRs on the big lifts, small lifts, whatever, and you notice changes in your body. Maybe your arms fell out your sleeves a little, you get a little tone or cut or built or whatever the word is. You're feeling more competent and confident, but also capable now. It builds lots of confidence in your skills, and that feeling becomes its own reward. I've talked about on this show, folks who come into Physique University or clients of mine who all they want to do is lose weight initially, but there's something inside them that says, no, I really want to look better, feel better, show up for my kids, show up for myself really, and live a long, healthy life. And we switch to from focusing on weight to focusing on lifting and performance and recovery and progress. And that becomes extremely rewarding. It starts to compete with food for that reward space in your brain. And that is a thing that exists called reward substitution. So remember that phrase, reward substitution. You're not fighting cravings. You're giving your brain a different source of satisfaction, right? You're swapping it out. So you don't have to, you don't have to get through that friction with willpower, right? You can swap it out and actually seek out the reward now. And there's an identity piece here. When you see yourself as a lifter, someone who trains, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, whatever it is, someone who builds strength and muscle, your food choices will line up with that. They're going to start to line up with that. Maybe not on day one, but you're going to be constantly trying to solve that problem for yourself in a good, positive way. Like you want to solve it. It's not that somebody's forcing you to do it or you're trying to diet or lose weight. You're not just trying to eat less either. Oftentimes you have to eat more. You're someone who's building a physique. And that mindset often protects you from crash dieting because it'll hurt your training. You know that it makes you value protein because you want to recover, and it makes a calorie deficit, if you decide to do that, feel like it has a purpose. And it can be short-term or it can be a little longer, but the point is it has a purpose. It's not just punishing yourself or thinking I have to lose weight. It's like, no, I want to reveal this muscle. And that's the narrative I see with folks, for example, who recently came into our program from the Get Lean in 45 Days workshop, who said, I want to reveal the muscle I've built. And if you haven't done it yet, that's fine. Build the muscle and then you can reveal it. But compare that to the cardio for fat loss, eating less for fat loss, eat less, move more mindset, running to burn off what you ate. You feel like you're doing it because you have to. And then food is an enemy, right? Food is a bad, and you call yourself bad, and I didn't do good, and I made bad choices. When I hear that language, I know you're in that mental state, and we can get you out of that. When you're lifting, food becomes fuel. Eating supports what you're trying to do. It doesn't work against it. It supports it. You're seeking out the fuel, but you can still enjoy the food too. And this is very psychological. I get it, but it's so important. People who build their fat loss phase around strength training, which by definition you have to do, or else you're going to lose muscle anyway, they stick with it longer. They stay more consistent. They don't spiral as hard when something goes off. They're like, no, I'm going to pick myself up and go the next day. The relationship with food and exercise works together. So I hope that's a place you want to be. All right, that's the brain stuff. I want to get a little more practical now. How do you set up your training to get these benefits for your appetite? Okay, it's because you might be thinking, okay, well, I already lift weights, so am I good? Well, there's a way to optimize it. Let's put it that way. So let's talk like a template here. I know some of you like systems and templates. If you want appetite control plus fat loss while keeping muscle, we know that strength training is the foundation. Walking is very important as well. Other forms of cardio are optional and the dose matters. So here's what like an appetite-friendly lifting week might look like. I would say 3 to 4 days a week, probably not 5 or 6, because that's where you could jump into the, too much fatigue and too much volume, which can drive compensation. The exception is if you are really intentional about keeping those sessions very short, if you are doing 5 or 6 days a week, in which case for some of you that might actually work better. Mostly compound movements, okay? So the big lifts, squats, deadlifts, presses, rows, pull-ups that hit multiple muscle groups, create the metabolic stress, build the most, muscle per hour invested, are probably going to have the best impact on your appetite because it's kind of like low and slow and you're not doing all of this volume and all these different exercises. You're very efficient with your time, etc. Moderate volume. So this is like 10 to 15 hard sets per muscle group per week for most people, which is honestly where you generally want to be anyway. Now, if you go less than that, it's probably going to help hunger even more, but it may not be enough volume for you. If you're in a severe fat loss phase or severe deficit, I should say, you may find you need to do fewer sets, but keep the intensity high, right? Keep the intensity high. You want to get challenged, but you don't want to destroy yourself because recovery is important here. If you're not recovered enough, just think of this. If you're not recovered enough, that also makes you hungry because your body is seeking those resources. And then of course, you still want isolation work in there if you're working on hypertrophy, if you're trying to, work on your physique. But of course, if you're in fat loss, you're mainly maintaining your muscle mass. You're not really building it. So it depends on if you're in a deficit or not. And that would be, whatever supports your joints and the aesthetics that you care about to support those compound lifts. So all the variations, all the isolation work, all the cable work, machine work, stuff like that. And, that's basically it. We talked about sleep and stress on a recent episode. You can go visit that because that's a whole other pillar that exists that affects appetite. But today we're talking about the training side. And I think if you simplify it to just what I talked about, I think it becomes more sustainable. You can focus on progress and it creates the hormones and also the behavioral environment that helps with appetite control. And you can measure your biofeedback and say, is this working for me? Now, if you want to include cardio, that's fine. Here are some quick rules I have related to appetite and cardio. I would say 2 to 3 sessions per week maximum. Okay. And keep it, if you like zones, I would keep it, upper zone 1 or lower zone 2, that easy conversational pace at most to kind of build that extra little bit of cardiovascular fitness that you're going for potentially, and also maybe burn a few more calories, sure. And 20 to 30 minutes maximum. Don't make these like hours long sessions. So 2 to 3 days a week, maybe 20 to 30 minutes. Avoid these long sessions because that will tend to trigger that compensation and the hunger. And, sprinting is a whole different beast that I love, 1 or 2 sprints a week. And we're talking my specific protocol, which we can make available to you. And we had a previous episode on that. But sprinting can be great because it's really not going to make you hungry at all, most likely. And fuel your cardio days appropriately. So think of deliberate cardio sessions as a form of training where you have, protein and carbs around your training, especially carbs, not training fasted if it makes you really hungry afterward. Obviously, there's a compensation mechanism there as well, potentially. And the point is cardio is not bad. It has benefits for cardiovascular health, for mental health, for recovery if you enjoy doing it. But it's obviously not the primary fat loss tool. That is your deficit. And then strength training is really important here for holding muscle, and also it can help with appetite. Okay, so if you're doing a lot of cardio and you're like, I'm always hungry and I'm not losing fat, that could be your answer. I would get rid of most of that cardio, just do training and walking and see what happens. So I want to clear up a few myths before we wrap up. I have 3 myths that I come up with that I think are important and I hear all the time. Myth number one is that cardio burns fat. And we kind of address this. A lot of you are like, yeah, I know that. But the reality is the fat loss, the release of energy from your fat cells is purely because of a calorie deficit. That's it. It's not any specific exercise. If cardio adds some calories to your metabolism, then it's part of the equation, but it still has to do with being in that deficit. And the strength training determines whether you lose fat or you lose some fat and muscle. We don't want to lose muscle, right? Training is what protects your muscle mass, your metabolic rate, all of that. And then cardio can contribute to the deficit, maybe by keeping your expenditure a little bit higher. But if the trade-off is you're a lot hungrier, more fatigued, not as recovered, that could be like taking 2 steps forward and like 1.5 steps back, or even 3 steps back, depending on how much you're doing. Myth number 2 is that, well, lifting doesn't burn many calories, so it's not really contributing to fat loss. But the reality is it's not about how many calories you burn. It's all the downstream effects where muscle mass, raises your resting metabolism long-term. Appetite suppression that we talked about in this episode will make your deficit easier, protecting your NEAT, because now you might move more generally throughout the day with low-grade movement because you're not compensating for it, and then being able to adhere to this and stay consistent, right? So we have to think the long game and think the whole equation here. And then myth number 3 is that, appetite really comes down to how well you can handle hunger and how well you can push through it. Appetite's way more complicated than that. It's got a bunch of inputs, right? Your hormones, your brain-related genes, let's be honest. Everybody's got different levels of appetite. Your gut signals, your sleep, your stress, your training, your protein. The food volume is important. Behavioral patterns. So willpower is a tiny, tiny piece of that big pie, and it's not the one that you want to have to rely on. So why don't we focus on the other inputs? How do we improve those, which are going to far outpace the willpower piece, right? So if you're white knuckling through your diet, something has to change. The system isn't set up to support you. And it could be just a matter of food volume. It could be a matter of the deficit's too aggressive. There's some answer there for you, okay? All right, let's bring this home. Fat loss isn't punishing yourself in a submission. It's really revealing the muscle you have in a targeted way. And strength training is one of the best tools in that toolbox versus anything else that I know of, right? It's also massively helpful for appetite because of the way it shifts your hormones, because of insulin sensitivity, how it protects your NEAT, but also mentally, how you think about yourself. You're doing hard things and you're building and you're working towards something in a positive way, and then your food supports that, right? So this is episode 7 of the 8. When you combine this episode, the training, with the nutrition stuff we covered previously, like protein, fiber, meal timing, energy density, tools like CaloCurb and others that might be helpful, you end up with the system to have hunger work support you. And we're just trying to chip away at that and use that engineering mindset to make the behavior you want the actual easier path of least resistance, if that makes sense. All right, remember I promised you a specific timing trick that uses post-workout appetite suppression to eliminate overeating. That's coming up right after this. Hey, this is Philip, and a quick reminder about today's sponsor, CaloCurb. If hunger has been the hardest part of your fat loss phase, even when everything else is dialed in, check out CaloCurb. It's a natural GLP-1 activating supplement with clinical data showing 40% fewer cravings and 30% less hunger within 1 hour, leading to 18% fewer calories, so you can stick to your fat loss plan. Go to witsandweights.com/CaloCurb for 10% off your first order. Link is in the show notes. That's witsandweights.com/CaloCurb. All right, you made it to the end, and here's the bonus I promised. We talked about how strength training creates a window of appetite suppression. It's usually 1 to 2 hours after a hard session where your hunger hormones are blunted and your satiety signals are increased. And here is how you can use that. I want you to train before the meal you most often overeat at. Okay. Now, I know this could be a change in your schedule if you train in the morning, but the meal you most often eat at is dinner. And that is the case for a lot of people, where the portions get out of control, where stacking continues after the meal, where the day's stress catches up, food becomes that release valve. Try scheduling your training late afternoon or early evening. Now, this goes contrary to some advice that I give probably the majority of the time for many people to shift their training to the morning to try to help out with their stress and their appetite and their consistency. So take it with a grain of salt, because this is specific to out of control overconsumption in the evening, and it's an experiment. All right. It's an experiment to go ahead and train late afternoon or early evening, not too late, lift hard, then come home, eat dinner during that 1 to 2 hour window afterward. And you might find that you naturally eat less, that the meal feels more satisfying with a smaller portion just because you got that blunted appetite, right? You just, I can't eat that much. I'm not like ravenous like I would have been otherwise. Now, if dinner isn't your problem, maybe it's late afternoon snacking, try mid-afternoon training session, finish around 2 p.m., 3 p.m., whatever makes sense, to carry you through that danger zone, so to speak. And just try a schedule change in your training. Some of you may need to do the opposite, move it to the morning and then have a decent size post-workout. But some of you need the opposite. You need a nice big meal in the morning. That'll set you up for better hunger signals throughout the day. Then you train later in the afternoon. At the end of the day, you have to find the thing that works for you. But I wanted to mention this as an option. All right, until next time, keep using your wits, lifting those weights. And remember that very lifting could be the key to helping with your appetite. I'll talk to you next time here on the Wits and Weights podcast.